All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to FSA Text-Based Writing using the FSA Writing Rubrics to guide instruction in grades 4 and 5. On our agenda today, we will first spend some time talking about the FSA ELA assessment. Then we will look at some trends and tips from the Department of Education regarding the ELA and text-based writing component. Then we will do an FSA rubric overview where we will spend some time really breaking down the language of the rubric. And then we will finish by doing some scoring. We will look at a prompt and a text set and some sample essays along with some scoring annotations to really understand how students score within the score ranges, and then finally end with a reflection. Here are the materials we are going to be using throughout the session. Again, if you were not able to print them, that's okay. We'll have everything on the screen that you need. We will have, of course, reference the writing rubric, specifically in the informative one. Then we will be using the grade 5 scoring sampler passage set and prompt and the scoring sampler essays from fsassessments.org. I encourage you to have a space to take some notes, and then at any point in the next little bit of time or so, you can get 2 highlighters or colored pencils. It doesn't matter what colors. That would be helpful. If you've printed a rubric, we're going to be doing some highlighting. I specifically use pink and blue, but any 2 colors that you can mark the text with, that's great. And then any additional documents that I reference, but you definitely don't need printed, you will be able to find those at fsassessments.org for further reference. So our norms for today is to just make sure your microphone is muted unless I'm asking for volunteers to read or you need to stop and ask a question, then please feel free to unmute those microphones. You can turn off your camera unless, we ask for interaction, which probably won't be until the very end of the session. And then if we are responding to the chat, utilize that feature when prompted. If you can go ahead, if your Zoom name is not your first class name, if you could go ahead and just type that into the chat for attendance purposes. I just want to make sure that you all get credit for being here. I also can't see the chat unless I have it pulled up. So again, it's just easier if you unmute and ask a question. If there's something right then that you want to know, please feel free to do so. And there will be times that we stop and answer questions and ask for clarification. So let's go ahead and start this morning by talking about the FSA ELA assessment. So text-based writing is just one component of the English Language Arts Florida Standards Assessment. You'll see here the 5 components that we have on the assessment: key ideas and details, craft and structure, integration of knowledge and ideas, language, and of course, text-based writing. So I want you to notice that text-based writing is in a different color this morning. Number 1, that's because that's what we are focusing on this morning. But number 2, so that you understand that while they are taken at separate times during the year, meaning the text-based writing assessment is typically taken the first week of April, and then the rest of the ELA test that covers those first 4 components are taken in May. So the reason for that is really to allow for that hand scoring of the student responses. It just takes a little bit longer. So it is one assessment. Both of those pieces go together to create one score for students. It is no longer 2 separate assessments like it used to be during the FCAT days here in Florida. Here's one of the documents that you did not need to print for today, and we're not going to be reading it in its entirety. I just wanted to point out to you that this is a resource that's available for you on fsassessments.org. This is the FSA Writing Test Design Summary and Blueprint, and it gives you a little bit of background into the scoring of the assessment. And I'm going to be explaining that scoring to you in much more depth in a few moments, because it is something that's not necessarily widely known, and it's really interesting information to know about the ELA assessment. You'll see also the standards that are assessed on the text-based writing component. They are consistent of writing and language standards, which go obviously with the language of the rubric. You'll see that in a moment. And just know that the same standards are covered for 4th and 5th grade. Another interesting piece of knowledge about the text-based writing component of the FSA ELA is that it is actually the only item on the test that is a DOK level 4 item. Every other item on the assessment is either a 1, 2, or 3. If you've been teaching writing or text-based writing, you know that it really is asking our students to think critically. While it's a writing assessment, we know that there is definitely a component of reading since it is text-based. So just one interesting thing to know that it is the only DOK level 4 item on the assessment. Then we have the Florida DOE test specifications. And what I really appreciate about this document is that it gives you a really good idea of what the assessment is going to look like. So it talks about the stimulus, which is really just the text set or the passages. It lets you know that the stimulus is going to be 2 to 4 texts or passages on a single topic that students will have to read and then respond to. It gives you a little bit more information about what some of those passages or texts may include, like graphics or pictures. Then it goes on to let you know about the word count. So this is really interesting. If you ever wanted to put together a practice assessment where you pulled a text set and created a prompt, the guidelines that the state follows is a minimum word count of 800 total and a maximum of 1,300 total. So whether there are 2 texts, 3 texts, or 4 texts, we know that it will never be less than 800 words, and it will never be more than 1,300 words. And that is the same number for 5th grade as well. Then they give us the prompt guidelines. And what this tells you is what the prompt will always look like for students. So this happens to be the informative one. So it will always start with write an informative essay about, and then give the topic. And then all of these reminders will be here for the students on the FSA. It will always remind them to use information from the passages. It will remind them to manage their time carefully so that they can go through all of those steps. And it will even give them some reminders of what pieces of the essay to include. So that's really nice. I always want my students to know that those reminders are going to be there. And these actually directly align to the 6 steps of writing that we use here in our district that we started this year in elementary. Here's the one for opinion essay. Basically the same thing, except it's going to tell you to give your opinion, and then of course remind you to do that opinion at the bottom. So if you ever wanted to write your own prompts, you could use these guidelines in order to format the language. The last item I'm going to show you of this document is this one, which basically gives you the possible topics that students may encounter on the text-based writing component of the assessment. You'll see this is kind of a broad, wide list, anything from social studies related topics to science related to topics to health, and then to animals, hobbies, things like that. So there's a pretty wide variety of topics that students may come across on the assessment. So if you are choosing topics, you can vary them pretty widely in order to give students access to practice all of these types. So let's get into the weighting and the scoring of the writing component. So this is the piece I was talking about that's not very widely known by teachers and administrators, but this is information that was shared with ELA supervisors by the state of Florida. So the ELA writing contributes 10 raw score points. So I want you to think about the rubric. The rubric itself is 10 points total. So that's where those 10 raw score points come from. However, what you need to know is that raw score is actually not the most important when considering a student's overall performance, because students answering more difficult items correctly actually receive more credit than students answering less challenging items. So each item, including that writing prompt, has a different effect in scoring depending on its level of challenge. And that's actually going to change and shift every single year, because every single year the writing prompt is different, and every single year some of the items on the assessment are different. This is actually also known as pattern scoring, and I'm going to go into this a little bit further with some graphics. So here's what I want you to think of. I want you to think of each of those pieces of paper on the screen being an item on the ELA assessment. So all of those multiple choice questions that students will encounter in May on the other part of the assessment, and the writing prompt. And I want you to think about the writing assessment as being 10 different pieces of paper, because you have a 1 in conventions, a 2 in conventions, a 1 in purpose, focus, and organization, a 2 in purpose, focus, and organization, and on and on and on. So you've got those 10 points on the rubric that actually are going to count for 10 different items on the assessment. What happens is every spring after students take the assessment, they then put the items in an order item booklet. And the way they do this is that difficulty is determined simply by the percentage of students who get an item right or wrong. The fewer students who answer an item correctly, the more difficult it is deemed. So you'll see that very first piece of paper says it was the easiest item on the FSA. That's going to be one of those multiple choice questions that 99% of the students in the entire state of Florida get correctly. It will be deemed the easiest item. Then that paper at the far top of the screen with the arrow, that's the most difficult or hardest item on the FSA. So that's going to be the one that the least amount of students actually get correct, and then it'll be deemed the most difficult item. And what I would need you to know about that difficult item is that the more difficult the item, the more it is worth, meaning it's more heavily weighted. So as a result, earning a high score on the writing is worth more, because here's the interesting thing you need to know. Over the past 5 years since FSA was implemented in the state of Florida, consistently the most difficult item on the FSA has been a score of a 4 in evidence and elaboration. So remember how I said each point on the rubric was a separate item? You'll see that described right there. Each score level is counted as a separate item. And consistently, a 4 in evidence and elaboration has been deemed the most difficult item. That means so few students in the state of Florida are actually scoring a 4 in that particular category that it's put there at the top of the list. So text-based writing includes some of those most difficult items. And as a result of that, a score of a 332 or higher can actually increase a student's entire FSA ELA level. So really what I want you to take away from this information is that while writing may only seem like 10 points out of 50 or 60, it really counts so much more than that because of the level of difficulty. So every point we can get our students to earn on that rubric is going to take them closer to that next level on the ELA assessment. So if you can get a student who had been scoring a 3 to score a 5 or a 6, that's going to help. If you can get a student who had been scoring a 6 or a 7 to get an 8 or a 9, that's going to help. So every point on this rubric counts. If you had been teaching ELA back in the FCAT days, you might remember that it was basically a 4 or higher. And if you didn't get that 4, then basically nothing counted for you. And that's different right now. We need to get every single point we can get on that rubric. Here are some tips to share from the Department of Education. These slides were shared with the ELA supervisors across the state. And what I want you to see is, based on the last 4 or 5 years of FSA text-based writing, here are some of the tips they have to make sure that we remind our students. Read the prompt carefully. What is the true intent of the prompt? So they really need students to understand how to break down and unpack those prompts so they know what mode of writing they're being asked to respond in, as well as what is the topic they're being asked to write about. Then you want to read that passage set carefully. Since it is a text-based response, even though it is a writing assessment, they have to read that passage set and understand and use that text evidence. Think carefully about the passage set, take notes, think about the purpose, the audience, and the task that goes along with unpacking the prompt. reread the prompt throughout the process so you don't forget your focus, plan your response, and then draft, reread, revise, and edit. So if you see that little handprint on the screen, the 6 steps for writing success, these are the 6 steps that we have introduced to the district this year in our writing lessons from the district. We have introduced these steps in grades 3, 4, and 5, and you'll see how those steps directly correlate to the tips and the reminders from the Department of Education. This is a process that we actually use here in Hillsborough County with students all the way through 8th grade. This is the first year it was introduced to elementary students, but we have been using this process in middle school for several years and have really determined that it's helpful for students to just remember what they need to do when they are responding to a text-based prompt. Here are some writing observations, patterns from the lower level responses that the state is seeing. So one of them is that the controlling idea is basically a simple or partial restatement of the prompt. So the controlling idea should absolutely give what the prompt topic is about. But what they're talking about specifically is that the student just restated the prompt, didn't necessarily give reasons or big ideas. And that's one of the patterns of a lower level response. Another one is seeing kind of that 3-pronged thesis where they basically are just taking the main idea of paragraphs from the passage. So instead of coming up with their own big ideas or their own reasons, they're just using the same ones that the author used and throwing that into their thesis. Another pattern of a lower level response is summary without elaboration. So this is particularly with informational prompts. I don't know if you've seen this with your students, but all students across the state of Florida, even all the way through middle school, actually have a more challenging time with informational prompts because what they end up doing is more of a summary or what I like to call kind of a book report or a regurgitation of everything the author stated. And that's not really what we're asking students to do. We'll talk more about that as we go. Another pattern is an over-reliance on formulaic writing. And really what they mean by that is using kind of the same very simple transitions, using maybe, a quote from somebody that they've been asked to memorize and kind of throw into their writing, whether it fits or not. That's really where they start to see those patterns. If they see 30 or 60 papers come across as they're scoring, and they see kind of every paper starting with the same hook or the same few transitions, they're going to start to see that as more of a formula and notice a pattern. Another one is argumentation or even opinion without settling on a side. So what do you think? So whether it's opinion in elementary or argumentation in middle school, they really need students to pick one side and stick to it. It can't sound wishy-washy. So students shouldn't be using that phrase. So what do you think? They should stick to their side and support it throughout. Another pattern is random details from the passages or irrelevant information. So one pattern I've seen from students is that they think that they have to include every detail from the text, and that's absolutely not the case. In fact, according to the rubric language, they really want students to show that they've thought about the evidence and that they have kind of strategically picked evidence to support their controlling idea or their opinion versus just mentioning everything they can. And then finally, an overuse of copied text. So like I said, really just using too much evidence, not enough elaboration or original thought, and we'll get into that as we go as well. Here are some other writing reminders from the state of education. Plop and drop evidence is not effective. So kind of just randomly picking evidence and kind of throwing it in willy-nilly without much thinking or thought process going into it. Mostly summary or quotes with little or no elaboration to connect to the controlling idea leads to ineffective development. A use of overblown expressions or trivial rhetorical questions kind of weaken that tone. So we want to make sure that if students are using techniques like rhetorical questions, that they really do kind of match the tone of the writing or fit within what they're writing about. Strict adherence to formulaic structures often limit the ability of the student to expand. So if they think they have to do a certain number of sentences, that can really start to kind of limit a student They need to know that it's really up to them how many sentences, and if they're able to do an extra sentence of elaboration or an extra piece of evidence, that they have that ability. And then just beware of consultants or programs or curriculums that claim to have kind of that silver bullet. There's not just one way to get a 10 on the text-based writing component. So we want to make sure that our students are kind of armed with as many tools and strategies as possible, and not just kind of stuck to one way of doing something. One example of that is possibly forcing students to always write 5 paragraphs with 3 body paragraphs, and that's not always going to be the best way for students to respond. So we need students to know that writing 4 paragraphs is also an option. If they feel like they're stuck or that they're forced to do something that doesn't really fit with the topic or the text set, then that's going to kind of hurt students. Integration of insight, evidence, and elaboration are key elements in text-based writing. We'll talk about this when we start breaking down the language of the rubric, but we know that this is a text-based writing assessment, and we know that with that text evidence, they're also going to need a balance of elaboration, insight, or original thought. Relevant, insightful anecdotes often strengthen the response, while generic, unimportant, one-time when anecdotes may weaken the development. So we want students to understand if they absolutely can include personal anecdotes and experiences, but we want them to be relevant to the topic instead of kind of those hypothetical one-time when anecdotes that might not fit. And then discernment, really just being able to choose that relevant evidence that supports their controlling idea or main point. That really goes into the scoring, whether they just randomly pick something or they pick something that matched and was relevant to their idea. Finally, we're going to look at some patterns from the higher level responses. So if you've ever wondered, how can my students get an 8 or a 9 or a 10? Here are some of the patterns the states observed from those papers. One is that the student is able to kind of demonstrate awareness of the big picture. So they're able to take it a little bit out of the text or out of the ideas from the text and relate it to kind of the universe or the big picture. Synthesis of text to show conceptual understanding, where the student is controlling the info. So the student is actually able to take evidence from source 1 and then evidence from source 3, all to back up their big idea or their reason. And then maybe take evidence from source 2 and another piece from source 1 to back up their other reason. It's really the student controlling the information rather than the authors, meaning body 1 is just about source 1, body 2 is about source 3, and body 3 is about source 3. That's not what they want students to do. Purposeful selection of relevant details from the text. We're talking about that so much, really the idea that they're able to pick those most relevant details. Counterclaim, this is only going to be a middle school bullet right here. When they get to 7th grade, they are to address that counterclaim in an argumentative piece. Don't worry, it doesn't come till then. Elaboration that furthers the textual evidence used to make the point. You'll see some examples of this in our sample essays, but it's more than just repeating that evidence. It's giving something that actually furthers the point. And then conventions just being controlled overall, because in order to get those higher scores, you're definitely going to need that 2 in conventions, which is the highest score. And what you're going to see in our sample essays is that it's actually quite simple for a student to receive a 2 in conventions. They do not expect a perfect paper. The state understands that's a timed draft. So errors are actually going to be present even in a 2. So that's good news. I want to stop here and see if there are any clarifying questions that you would like me to answer on the information that we've gone over so far before we get into our next piece. If there are, please just unmute your mic and feel free to ask. All right, awesome. I'm going to go ahead and keep going then. So I want you to think about the question on the screen. How does the use of a rubric improve student performance? What I'd like you to do is I want you to just take about 2 minutes. And if you've got some place to jot down some notes or do a little quick write, I'd like you to do that. If not, just do some thinking about this question. And then I'm going to be asking for a few people to share. So how does the use of a rubric in general improve student performance? And I'll come back and ask for volunteers in about 2 minutes. All right, I'd love to hear from a few of you about your thoughts on this question. If anybody would like to unmute and let us know what you're thinking.
Well, what I was thinking is that the rubric can help them see specific strengths and weaknesses so that they can improve on their next writing. Just putting a grade on it and marking through and saying this is right, is wrong, is not as beneficial as having a rubric where we can say, oh, let's take a look at your spelling, that hurt you in this area. Or, oh, let's take a look at this, that was too vague. It gives them a pinpoint on something that they can specifically work on.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. Does anybody else have any other ideas?
I think it helps teachers for conferencing to know exactly what's important to talk to students about.
Absolutely.
As an endpoint, some clarity.
Yes, absolutely.
It also helps let the students know what their expectations in writing is going to be.
Yes, definitely. We don't want students to feel like we're trying to catch them, off guard. We want students to know exactly what they would need to include in their response in order to score that 7, that 8, that 9, and that 10. Absolutely. So here's another question for you I'd like you to think about regarding the same topic. And I want you to think about what kinds of feedback do you use in your own classroom? And this could be for any content area. It doesn't have to be writing. I just want you to think about what kinds of feedback are you using in your classroom and how effective are they for helping students improve? So what type of feedback are you using that you think is really effective? And I want you to go ahead and type these responses in the chat, and I will pull it up and take a look as you're typing. So I'm seeing a pattern with your responses, and I'm seeing a lot of one-on-one conferencing with students. And that's actually my absolute favorite strategy to use to give feedback. And I'm actually going to be doing a conferencing session with our literacy leaders this week in their monthly meeting. And it's going to be something that I will be sharing in Canvas. It's just kind of a quick little session on what writing conferences are and what they can look like and how to kind of implement them in your classroom. Because as a writing coach for the last 10 or so years, I have actually seen writing conferencing be kind of like the one thing that improves student performance more than anything else I've ever done. So I'm a huge proponent of it. If you don't know much about it, I encourage you to even just get on YouTube and look up writing conferences, because it absolutely is a fantastic way to provide feedback to students. So let's get into the rubric itself. If you were able to print a rubric, we'll be looking specifically at the informative rubric, but if you're not, here is what our rubric looks like for the state of Florida. It is kind of a two-sided document where on the front you have your 4 and your 3 score points, and then on the back you have your 2, your 1, and your 0, which is only in conventions. One thing that's good to know is that the informative and the opinion rubrics are actually exactly the same rubrics, except for it'll say controlling idea on informative, and it'll say opinion statement on the opinion. Everything else is virtually the same exact thing. So if you're scoring one type and you only have the other type of rubric with you or at your disposal, no worries, it's really the same thing. What you'll notice as we start really breaking down the language of the rubric is that it is using very specific language of our standards. It outlines those expectations for students. And I encourage you to make notes as we go. I'm going to be first going over the structure and the format of the rubric, and then really getting into the specific language of each score points. And then I've got some kind of analogies or phrases that I use for the score points. When I feel like I'm getting kind of in a rut with my scoring, I use these phrases to really kind of go with my gut. And I'm going to be sharing those with you as well. Also, if you just would rather take pictures of the screen, please feel free to do that. I don't mind at all. You might see some things on here that you don't have time to write down, but you'd like to keep for future reference. So here we go. So some FSA rubric reminders. There are 3 scoring domains on our rubric. So we have domain 1, which is purpose, focus, and organization. We kind of refer to that as PFO. Then we have evidence and elaboration, that's EE. And then we have our conventions of standard English. So 3 scoring domains that we are giving a score point for students as we score. Then you'll see that within each score point, there are what we call overarching statements. And then there are kind of bulleted descriptions under those overarching statements. So what I want you to know is that the overarching statement is really going to be what we kind of stick with if you're stuck, because it really is giving you the information. What is the scoring element about, and how effectively did the student do it in order to score this particular score point? But what's really great about those bullets is that they really do give you a little bit more information about each specific score point. But what I also need you to know about those bullets is that we do not use them as checklists. So it's not, okay, if you got 4 of these bullets, then you're definitely this, or you had 2 bullets over here, but you only had 1 bullet over here. I want you to think of them more as buckets. So which cell or bucket is a piece fitting in more than other cells? So I kind of use the statement, where is the preponderance of evidence? Is it in the 4 or is it in the 3? So those bullets are really important because they do give you a little bit more specific information, but they are in no way, shape, or form a checklist where a student has to have a certain number of those in order to meet the criteria of that score. Now, within each domain, you are going to score individually. So in PFO, when you are scoring for PFO, you are only focusing on the elements within that category. You cannot look at their spelling that's maybe bad and then mark them down in PFO, because it's a different convention. So if you were around in FCAT days, it's a little bit of a different mind frame. And in FCAT days, it was kind of this one holistic rubric out of 6 points. You looked at the overall paper and decided whether it was a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. For this specific rubric, we actually look at each domain and score individually, and then those numbers are kind of added up out of 10 for their total score. So here are those analogies or phrases that I like to use when I may be stuck in between score points. If you've ever sat down and scored a bunch of papers at one time, you really start to second guess yourself. Well, if that's a 3, then that probably wasn't a 3. And I do that all the time. So here's one thing that I like to use. What you'll see here on the screen is all the way to the left is going to be just a 4, and then it goes 3, 2, and 1. And this just happens to be the PFO 4, 3, 2, 1. That's not important. But across the top of your rubric, what I'd like you to put for a 4 is that they are doing it well. A 4 in any category is going to be strong. It's going to be consistent. It's going to be skillful. They're doing it well. It's almost above and beyond. If you see a paper that's scoring a 4 in either PFO or EE or both, you're going to almost notice it automatically the first time you read it, that it's just a really, really good example or a good response. What you need to know about a 3 is that they're just doing it. Think of Nike, just do it. It's okay, it's mediocre, it's adequate. But what's really interesting to know about a 3 is that this is actually meeting proficiency of the grade level standards. So when you want to know what is proficient by the state, it is a 3 in PFO and a 3 in evidence and elaboration. So you may be thinking to yourself, how is a mediocre or an adequate response meeting the proficiency of the standards? Well, that's the language of the standards. A 4 is actually better or doing it well or above and beyond. So for our students to get a 332 on the assessment is actually exactly where we'd want them to be to master the grade level standards. And if they can get higher than that, it's just icing on the cake. A 2, the student is trying to do it. It's inconsistent, it's uneven, it's inadequate. You can tell that the student kind of knows what to do, but they're just not hitting the mark in some places. This may be a paper where body 1 has evidence and elaboration, but maybe body 2 kind of drops off and maybe only has evidence or only has elaboration. And that's where that uneven word would come in. A score point of a 1 is really, I just don't know what to do. There's little to none. Things may be missing. It may be a bit confusing. So it's kind of on topic, but you really can see that the student just doesn't really know what to do with the information or how to craft or draft the response. So these are a few phrases that I like to use when I'm really just stuck in between 2 score points. And then I have another one for you, and this is the driver analogy. So when you think of a 4, I want you to think of the student is driving the piece. They are in control of the GPS. The ideas are student driven and the reader is just along for the ride. So like I said in that 4, it's almost those papers that you're going to notice kind of automatically when you read it the first time through. You really see that the student is in control of their evidence, and it's not just that kind of regurgitation or summary of what the author put. A 3, the piece is still driven by the student. Of course, if we're meeting grade level standards, we need that student to still be driving the piece, but the ideas just may not be as developed as that 4. For a 2, the student needs help with directions. They took the wrong exit and they're not really sure how to get back on the interstate. And then finally, for that 1, we don't even know who is driving or what is going on with the piece. So these are just some fun phrases and analogies I like to use when I'm scoring. I have them at the top of all my rubrics that I use. So if you'd like to write these down or take a picture of the screen, feel free to as a nice reminder.
Is it possible to have some of these things sent via email? Because I'm taking pictures with my phone, but it's not really clear because the rubric is not really clear on the Zoom.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Absolutely. I can forward you this PowerPoint, and I also plan on sharing this recording in Canvas, so you'll be able to go back and watch it again, but I can absolutely forward you this.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so some more reminders before we start really breaking down the language. In a score point of a 3 or a 4, you're really focusing on what the students are doing well or their strengths. Remember that 3 and 4 is where they are meeting or going above the standards. And then when you focus on score points 1 and 2, when we just talked about they really just don't know what to do or they're just trying to do it, you really focus on kind of what's missing the mark or their weaknesses. And you'll start to see how the language in the rubric kind of matches this idea. So final reminders, there are 3 scoring domains: purpose, focus, and organization. Those focus on the structural elements of the response. Then you have evidence and elaboration, that's focusing on the support and the content elements. And then you have your conventions, of course, our grammar, usage, mechanics, and spelling. There are specific descriptors in each domain for each score point. Those are those overarching statements and those bullets. Remember that each domain is scored analytically and separately within a holistic mindset. So you're going to give a score in PFO of 1 to 4 points. You'll give a score in evidence and elaboration of 1 to 4 points, and then you'll give a score in conventions, a 0, a 1, or a 2. So again, this is our rubric. This is where you are going to use those highlighters if you were able to grab them. So I can give you about a minute if you're able to grab colored pencils or highlighters if you were able to print a rubric. Don't worry if you weren't. You can take pictures of the screen, and then, like I said, I will forward you guys this PowerPoint so you'll be able to look at it and highlight it at a later time. But what we're going to be doing is we are going to be looking across a domain. So what I mean by that is we will look at the 4 in PFO, we will compare it and contrast it to the 3 in PFO, then compare it and contrast it to a 2 in PFO, and then a 1 in PFO. So our rubrics are 2-sided. So if you have this printed out, you may be having to flip from the front to the back. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 4 red boxes and put them just across the screen or down the screen so that we just focus on that 4, that 3, that 2, and the 1 within purpose, focus, and organization. So here they are. You'll notice I don't even have the bullets on the screen. I'm just really looking at those overarching statements first. So again, this is the overarching statement for a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1 in purpose, focus, and organization. So what I like to do here, and this is a method or a strategy that we actually use in our middle school rubric training that we've used for years. And I think it's a really great visual to really see the differences and the similarities between each score point within a specific domain. So you'll see I've made myself a little legend or a key down there. I'm going to use blue to highlight or mark the commonalities between the score points, and then I'm going to use pink to highlight the differences between the score points. So what you need to know about the commonalities is we're actually going to start by looking at what's common between each score point. And what these are these really are outlining the expectations for the students' writing. So when I want you to think of the blue or the commonalities is, what is this scoring element all about? What evidence are we looking for in this domain? So you'll see as we start highlighting what I mean by that. So for instance, the first, as I kind of skim through these statements, the first commonality I see is the word sustained. And I see that in a 4, a 3, and a 2. Now I don't see that word in a 1 because 1 is kind of always going to be a little bit different. But I see that in 3 of the domains. So I'm going to mark that as a commonality. I see that's something that this element is obviously focused on. So I'm going to highlight that in blue. The next commonality I see as I skim through is purpose, audience, and task. And I see that particular phrase in every single score point down purpose, focus, and organization, even in the 1. So that's really going to tell me one of the main focuses of this domain is purpose, audience, and task. The next commonality I see across these score points is the controlling idea. So I'm going to highlight that as I go down. I know that one of the main things I'm going to look for in this particular domain is the controlling idea and how effective it is. And then finally, I noticed that organizational structure is mentioned in every single overarching statement. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that as well. So just a reminder, what we've done here is we've looked at the commonalities across the score points within one domain. These are kind of those words or those phrases that really tell you what this scoring element is all about. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we are going to identify the differences, right? These are kind of those descriptors that determine to what extent did the student do this or how effectively did they do this. So this is where we'll take our second color. And for me, I'm using pink. So you'll see how sustained is it in a 4? Well, it's fully sustained. So in order to get a 4, one element is that the response is fully sustained. In a 3, it might just be adequately sustained. In a 2, it's somewhat sustained. And then in the 1, this is where we see that it just may be related to the topic. So you'll see here what we're doing is we're looking at the commonality, and then we're determining to what extent or how effectively did the student do that piece. And that's where we see these kind of descriptors or adjectives for these words. Let's look at purpose, audience, and task. How effectively did the student do it? Well, in a 4, it is consistently focused within that purpose, audience, and task. Within a 3, it's just generally focused. Within a 2, there may have some loosely related or extraneous material. So kind of going along with the fact that it might have some extra stuff in it, might have some loosely related stuff in it. Remember, a 2 is they're just trying to do it. And then a 1, it's going to have little or no awareness of that purpose, audience, and task. So hopefully what you're starting to notice, like I had on a previous slide, is that the language in the 3 and the 4 kind of focuses on the strengths or what the student does well. And then when you get to the language of the 2 and the 1, now it's really focusing on kind of what they didn't do or what are their weaknesses. The next difference that we will mark and highlight is that controlling idea. So how effective is it? Well, it's clearly stated in a 4. In a 3, they're just going to have one. Also in a 2, they will probably have one. It says may. And then in a 1, it's no discernible controlling idea. Little or no discernible controlling idea. And then finally, let's look at that organizational structure. So how effectively did the student do that? Well, it's very effective in a 4. It may just be evident in a 3. It may be inconsistent in a 2. And the 1, of course, is still that little to no discernible structure. So really the idea behind this process is just to notice those commonalities and those differences within the score point so that you know when you are scoring within this domain specifically, these are the elements you're focusing on. Evidence and elaboration is not mentioned here because that's not what this domain is about. Conventions are not mentioned here because that's not what this domain is about. So it's really knowing what this domain is about and then how effectively is the student doing that within their response, and that's how you might determine their score. Now, we're not going to do the highlighting with the bullets, but I do want you to know that those bullets are an important piece of our scoring. They do give those more specific descriptors between score points. And they're going to give you a little bit more detail when it comes to things like referencing sources, sentence structure, and things like that. Now we're going to do the same process with evidence and elaboration, but before we go there, I want to show you one more thing in this overarching statement, and that's the idea that in a 4 and in a 3, you're going to see that the response is going to include most of the following, which means those bullets that follow. If you're going to score within a 3 or a 4, you're probably going to meet most of those items. But in a 2 or a 1, it just says may include the following. So again, a 2 and a 1 is definitely going to be missing things or not do things well. So it's not necessarily going to meet kind of the descriptions of all of those bullets underneath. All right, let's take a look at evidence and elaboration. So
May I
I did
ask a question?
yes.
Is this the rubric we're gonna use to grade the papers? This exact rubric?
So this is the rubric you use to grade all student responses in 4th and 5th grade. This specific one is informational, and if you're referring to the mid-year assessment, that is an opinion assessment. But like I said, the rubrics are exactly the same except for that word controlling idea and opinion.
So I'm grading the one that they just took using this for.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, ma'am. It's just instead of controlling idea, I want you to think of an opinion statement.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So here we're going to take a look at the overarching statements for evidence and elaboration. So again, all I did was just kind of pull the overarching statement from the 4, the 3, the 2, and the 1. We'll start by identifying those commonalities to let us know what this scoring element is all about. So as you skim through the statements, you'll notice that support and evidence is mentioned in every score point. That fits very well with what this category is, which is evidence and elaboration. Then we do see the controlling or the main idea mentioned again here. And what I want you to know is that while the controlling idea is mainly focused on NPFO, this is mentioned here because you're talking about their evidence or support for that controlling idea or that opinion statement. So again, it's not how effective is the controlling idea, but are they actually giving evidence to support that controlling idea? And then finally, you'll see a commonality of sources, facts, and details. So this is when we're really getting into those sources that they're having to read, and then those details that they're giving in the elaboration. As we start scoring student samples, you'll really start to see kind of the difference between the two and how students can do those things effectively and even ineffectively in the lower scoring responses. So now that we've determined what this category is all about, let's look at the differences or how effectively students do these things within their responses. So in order to receive a 4 in evidence elaboration, which if you remember from the beginning of the session, that is the most difficult item on the ELA assessment. So very few students are able to score a 4 in this category because they are having to provide thorough and convincing support and evidence. And a 3, it's just adequate. A 2 is going to be uneven or cursory. And a 1 is going to be minimal support and evidence. And a 4, that student is going to have effective use of sources, facts, and details. In a 3, it's just going to use them. In a 2, it may be ineffective. And in a 1, it's going to be little, if any, use of those sources, facts, and details. So what are the expectations for the students writing within this domain? And then how effectively or to what extent did they do that element? We are going to move on to our last domain and do this strategy with it. And this is conventions. So for conventions, I've actually included the bullets just because it gives a little bit more detail rather than the overarching statement. But again, we're going to look at what this domain is all about and then how effectively do they do that. You'll see that the commonality is that command of conventions all the way down to that 0. The difference is going to come in the wording of adequate for a 2, partial for a 1, lack of command in a 0. I'm going to highlight something else in that 0, and that's that the errors often obscure the meaning. So let's talk a little bit more about conventions because it is the only domain that is 2 points, not 4 points. And it's also the only domain that you can give a 0 in. So conventions really drive the understanding for the reader. And what you need to focus on here is the patterns of errors. So like I said earlier, it is a timed draft, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So you'll see even in a 2, they're just saying adequate. They're not saying perfect. And they're even saying that some minor errors in usage may occur. So what they mean by that is maybe they've misspelled a few words and maybe they left off a capital letter or something. That's going to still be okay to get a 2. When you really start to talk about those patterns of errors, that's when you'll start to see, well, there's spelling issues, there's punctuation issues, there's capital letter issues, there may be sentence formation issues, right? Like you're having definitely more than 1 or 2 errors within the passage, and that's going to give you, kind of drop you down to that 1. And then to see a 0 is really going to be, first of all, it's typically a very brief response. And that very brief response may just have no kind of conventions, meaning maybe it's 1 or 2 sentences, but there's no capital letters, the spelling is a mess, there's no end punctuation, so you really have no idea where the sentences begin and end. A 0 is going to definitely have that severity, that density of errors where you often can't even understand where one thought starts and one thought, begins. Another thing to take into account for conventions is really the density. So what I mean of is like the lack of or the amount of writing. So if it's a really short response, it's going to be a lot easier to kind of mark down on the conventions because they haven't given you enough to even show that they have command or don't have command. So it really can drive to those lower convention scores a little bit quicker if it's a much shorter or brief response. And you're going to see examples of every single one of these score points on conventions in our sample essays. So you'll see the types of errors a student may have and still receive a 2. You're going to see how those errors get a little bit worse in a 1. And then you're going to see an example of what a 0 in conventions might look like. So we're going to do kind of a gist or a summary of each of these domains one more time, give a few more tips from the state of Florida, and then we will take our break for the morning. So what does PFO mean? A lot of times I use this information for students specifically when they just kind of need to know a little bit more about each domain, and the language on the rubric may be a little overwhelming for them. So kind of in a nutshell, PFO is all about the purpose. Did the student respond in the correct writing mode, meaning informative or opinion? Focus is, did the student respond to or answer the prompt in the task? Did the student stay on topic throughout the response? That's where that focus comes in. And then organization, did the student organize their response into a multi-paragraph structure? The assessment is always going to tell students to write a multi-paragraph response. So that is what they're wanting to see on that response. There is no number or rule of number of paragraphs, but they are asking for a multi-paragraph response. Now we know that that is going to, in an effective response, include their first paragraph, which is what we call their introduction. Within that introduction, they have that thesis statement, controlling idea or opinion. It's that statement that answers the prompt and previews their reasons or what those paragraphs will be about. It could include a hook and a bridge to connect those two things. That's what you're going to see in those high scoring papers. And then it's going to have 2 or 3 body paragraphs with at least 2 pieces of cited evidence and insightful elaboration within each paragraph. And then have a last paragraph or conclusion to wrap up their piece. Know that body paragraphs should start with a transition and a topic sentence, and that transitions should also be used within paragraphs to connect ideas, especially in those higher scoring responses. So this is kind of in a nutshell what PFO really means. But then when you look at the bullets within PFO, it gets a little bit more descriptive or specific about the transitions and kind of those progression of ideas.
Sharon, could you elaborate again on that hook and bridge?
Yeah, so basically, in a higher scoring paper, you're going to have more than just the controlling idea or opinion within the introduction. Typically, it will start with some sort of hook or attention grabber, something that may be elaboration, that may be kind of setting a scene, where you're just grabbing the reader's attention. And then the bridge is kind of the statement we use for that transition between the hook and the controlling idea or opinion. So if I start with a question per se as my hook, then my bridge is going to kind of be that answer to the question that then leads me into the controlling idea or opinion. And you'll see some examples of these within our higher scoring sample essays that we look at in a few minutes. But typically, if it's going to score a 3 or a 4 in PFO, it is going to have more in the introduction than just that controlling idea or opinion. Now for evidence and elaboration, kind of in a gist, what does this mean? It's really all about, did the student response include direct quotes or paraphrased information from the text set? So either are acceptable forms of text evidence, but they need to have that text evidence. Does the evidence selected support the controlling idea? So again, did they pick the best evidence or did they just randomly throw in information? Does it reflect evidence from multiple sources? So the prompt is going to remind students to use more than one source and to avoid over relying on one source. So they do want them to use evidence from multiple sources. A good kind of thing to remember is if there are 4 sources, it'd be really good for the students to use evidence from at least 2 to 3. If there are 3, they really need to use evidence from at least 2. So the idea is that definitely more than one sources to pull evidence from. How many pieces of evidence have been included? So there's not a magic number, but what we can see from the sample essays that the state has released is that never, ever, ever will one piece of evidence per body paragraph be enough to score proficiently. So if they're doing a 4-paragraph essay, but they've only included 1 piece of evidence in body 1 and 1 piece of evidence in body 2, they will absolutely not be able to score a 3 or a 4 in evidence and elaboration. What you'll kind of notice as a pattern within the proficient papers that we look at is that most students are using 2 to 3 pieces of evidence within each body paragraph. And then did the student include elaboration as a follow-up to their evidence? So we want to teach students that every time they have that piece of evidence that they have some sort of elaboration or original thought to go with each piece of evidence. And did that elaboration provide insight or demonstrate original thought? Meaning it really needs to be something that's not mentioned or found anywhere in the text set to determine whether it's original thought or not. And then finally, citations. Did the student cite the source or text? And is the citation specific, meaning source number, paragraph number, text title, or author's name? We're going to talk a little bit more about the citations and the referencing so that you truly understand what students need to do to be proficient in this category on the next slide. So we'll get to that. But just so you kind of are reminded again, this is the most challenging domain on the entire rubric because it's really asking students to show that synthesis across sources or across texts where they're able to control the information. I can pull something from this source and something from this source to back up my controlling idea or my opinion. So let's get into those referencing and citations. This is that information directly from the Department of Education. In a 3 and 4 of evidence and elaboration, it does refer to the referencing of sources. We want to make sure our students know simple but clear ways to cite or reference their sources. So any of the following may be used. They can use the title of the passage or text. They could use the paragraph number, they could use the author's name, or they could use the source number, because all of the sources will definitely be numbered on every FSA assessment. So whatever text 1 is, it will say source 1 and then source 2 and then source 3. So here's what you need to remember about the citation or the source referencing of the sources is that a citation must happen at least one time in their response to get a 3 or a 4 in this category. So they've got to somewhere at least one time say according to source 1 or according to Bob Smith or according to whatever the title is, that has to be in there at least once to open the door to a 3 or a 4. If they are using a direct quote or directly copied evidence, it absolutely must have a citation or reference to the source. And then we want to make sure that students keep the references simple but varied. So here's what I mean by that. We don't want them to say, according to the article, blah, 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 by Bob Smith in paragraph 12, which is source 2, it says, right? That's definitely not the kind of citation we want to see. That really interrupts the flow of the writing. So instead, they could say, according to source 1, and then do the quote or the paraphrasing. And then maybe the next time it just says source 2 states. So again, it's kind of simple. It's just using one of those strategies, but it doesn't say according to source every single time. There's really no one right way to do it. I'm going to give you my experience. And my experience is that I always encouraged source number with my students. And sometimes they'd add the paragraph number kind of in parentheses at the end. But I steered my students sometimes away from title and author, and here's why. I have seen some texts that actually don't have authors' names on them. And if a student only knows to cite using an author's name and then they're not given an author's name, they kind of get stuck and frustrated. And I never want my students to feel that way in an assessment. So I always want students to know that it's okay if there's not an author's name because there are other ways to cite. As far as the title of the passage, it's absolutely okay for them to use that as their citation. But I've seen a lot of passage articles that the titles are really lengthy, or sometimes they're even a question. And then when you're using that in a citation, it can get kind of bogged down in the writing. So I always want my students to know that any of these are acceptable ways to cite, but that they don't need to just do, stick with one or be stuck with one, because they want to have that flexibility within their writing. Any clarifying questions on citations or references that you want to unmute for right now? All right, perfect. I want to talk to you about one more thing about scoring before we go to our break, and that is a copy score. So the scorers, the people that the state of Florida hires to score our student responses for FSA, they know the text sets very well. In fact, they read them multiple times each day that they are scoring. And that is so that they are able to identify when a student is not including any original thought. So some of our students have gotten pretty skillful and crafty at writing responses that include a lot of paraphrased information and that even might trick you into thinking that they're using original thought, but really it was just an idea that they got from the text set or the passage. And if you don't know that text set or that passage set very well, then you may be fooled by students being a little crafty in their writing. In fact, I've done some middle school scoring trainings where teachers have asked me to kind of rescore a paper, and I'll say, oh, you know, this paper would get a 0. It would receive a copy score. And they're like, are you serious? I gave it a 7, you know, because it looked like a really good essay and it sounded really good, but it was actually because they were just taking all of the ideas from the author and kind of putting it in their own words. So let's talk about this. In order to qualify as a scoreable paper, a student must give a controlling idea, a reason, and a little bit more, meaning original thought. So in order to receive a copy score, that paper would demonstrate 0 original thought. Often the introduction is kind of just that prompt followed by copied phrases from the text. Each paragraph may have some transition words thrown in there, but then it's going to be followed only by either direct copy or paraphrasing of text. And then the student may have tried to substitute a few words here or there, but again, that's not going to be enough to show original thought. Now, this is an interesting thought to get that copy score, and we do have a sample essay at the end of today that will show you what a copied paper might look like and how you could determine whether or not it would receive this copy score. So a copy score is one of the ways that a student receives an overall 0 on their paper. So let's talk about that rubric again. Remember how I mentioned you can't give a 0 in PFO or evidence and elaboration. So basically you can't say it's a 0 in PFO, but it's a 1 in evidence and elaboration. Those are not possible score points. If a paper is going to receive an overall 0, then it needs to meet one of the criteria on this screen. So the first one is that it's totally blank, meaning no valid ELA score because the student did not attempt to take the writing portion of the assessment. So remember I mentioned at the very beginning that the ELA test is just one test, and they do take it at different times because the text-based writing component is taken a month earlier than the remainder of the test, but it is just one test. So if you have a student that is out of town in April and does not take the writing assessment, but they come back in May and take the reading kind of portion of the assessment, they're not going to get a score. They have to sit for both portions of the test. Now, if they do sit for the assessment and still receive a 0, this is why. Either they wrote the response in foreign language or it was not written completely in English. It was totally illegible, incomprehensible, or insufficient, meaning it was probably not more than a few words and those words made no sense or couldn't be read at all. It was copied from the sources with no original writing. That was the screen we previously talked about. It was blank, meaning they were in attendance for the test, but they chose not to write anything down. And then finally, the last one is that it's totally off topic. But the state has actually started to try to give them a convention score if this is the case. So let's say the topic is the problem of light solution, but they just write about light in general. That's not really addressing the topic, but what the state will do to at least give them a point or 2 is to try to score their conventions. We don't necessarily want to advertise that with our students to know that they could write off topic and still get a 2, but it's nice to know as a student, if you have a student that does that on the day of the assessment, they might just get a convention score. So this is kind of the final information, all about the rubric, all about the trends that the DOE is seeing in our student responses and what we as teachers need to know in order to really guide them to success on this particular assessment. If there are any questions about anything we've covered up to this point, I'd like you to please unmute and ask. And then we're going to take a 10-minute break this morning so that we can grab another cup of coffee or take the dog out if we need to, and then we'll come back. So any burning questions right now? All right, amazing. We will take a 10-minute break. So we will come back right at about 9:29 and resume our session for today. Thank you so much. All right, we're back. We are now ready to get into our scoring portion of the session. And hopefully, as you already are aware, in order to effectively score student responses, we do have to have knowledge of our grade level standards. We take those into account. That's where some of the language from the rubric comes from. It's good to know those FSA test specs that we went over at the beginning of the session. So if you are, planning for instruction, it's good to have these things in mind. Of course, the writing rubrics, and then the scoring sampler. So we are going to spend some time with one of the state's scoring samplers that they provide for us on fsassessments.org. But another word for the scoring sampler are anchors or anchor papers. And what I need you to know about anchor papers is that this is actually the method that our FSA scorers use in order to score our students' responses. So in addition to using the rubric, they actually have a set of anchor papers that they are referencing throughout their scoring in order to really make sure they're within a range of each score point. So the sampler essays that we're going to be looking at for the next hour or so is a sampler set or an anchor set of papers that you can also use for reference when you're scoring your student responses. So while the responses won't be on the same topic that your students have written about, it's still giving you an idea of, well, my student kind of did this, and that really fits with this paper. This student did that and that. They got a 2-2, and this looks more like a 2-2. So these anchor sets are really a useful resource for teachers. We're going to be looking at the 5th grade one because it's the informative set. But in 4th grade, there's an opinion anchor set that's available for you guys on fsassessments.org. And it doesn't really matter 4th or 5th grade. You can use either of those sets for your students when scoring papers. You can also use these anchor papers with your students. One idea is to put it up under the Elmo and have students either identify the strengths or the weaknesses within each paper, and then you could have them even do revisions to the lower scoring papers to make them better, or even try out some of the strategies that are used in the high scoring papers in their own papers as they revise. So these anchor sets really are just a super useful resource for teachers in all ways. They also include annotations, which we'll be looking at today, but in addition to the state telling you what the paper scored, they're also going to give you very, very detailed annotations to explain each element within that score point. And you can use these, of course, like I just said, to score your district writing assessments as anchor papers. So let's get on with it. We are going to be looking at the 5th grade prompt and text set for the scoring sampler, and that is on light pollution. If you were able to print it, that's great. If not, no worries. We'll have everything we need on the screen for you to see. And this is where I'm going to start asking for volunteers to unmute and read. So hopefully we can all participate in this process. Now, before we start reading, what I want to kind of give you some information about is what's called range finders. So every year for the past 5 or 6 years, I've been fortunate enough to be invited by the state of Florida to serve on the range finder committee. And basically what we do in the range finders is once a year we get together in Tallahassee, and we actually are able to see the FSA that our students will encounter. So I get to see the prompt and the text set and the topic that our students will be asked to write about. I'm sworn to secrecy, so I have to sign all kinds of security agreements. So obviously I can't share that information. But within that committee and within that week-long experience, we score and read hundreds of student responses that had been done back in the piloting stage. And what we do is we identify the anchor papers that the scorers will then use when they're scoring our students' responses. So like I said, we read hundreds of responses. We determine what is the highest 442 we're able to find, what's maybe a low 442 that we're able to find. Then we find a high 332, and we go all down the score points so that by the end of it, there's a set of 30 or 40 papers that each scorer gets as an anchor set, and they're able to see what would a 110 look like, what would a 221 look like, what might a 312 look like, right? So really seeing what a paper might look like in all of those ranges. So I've been fortunate to serve on this committee for the last 5 or 6 years, which is where a lot of this kind of knowledge and experience in scoring comes from. So I'm happy to share that with you. This is the protocol that they use when we are on this committee. Is we start every morning by reading the prompt. We then read the text set aloud as a group. We mark the text for evidence because we really need to know what types of evidence our students may be using. We go back to that prompt periodically to remind ourselves what we're looking at. We read each student essay aloud in the room. Then we take some time to mark notes and think about the score. And then we finally discuss and come to a consensus on that score. So we're going to follow somewhat same protocol today, where we're reading the prompt and the text set aloud. We will read each student essay aloud. But the difference will be is that these essays are actually already scored. So we're just going to talk about why they scored what they scored. All right, let's unpack the prompt. If you are using our district created lessons this year, you'll know that one strategy we've mentioned for unpacking is to ask students to tap into their writing. And that's really using that language of the rubric of task, audience, and purpose. So we want students to be able to identify those elements. And for this one specifically, their purpose is to write an informative essay. Their audience is their class, and their task is about the problem of light pollution. So you'll see that kind of spelled out here. We know that these are the 3 elements that we need students to be able to identify. Now, there are multiple strategies and acronyms to use for unpacking. It doesn't matter which one you teach your students, as long as they truly are able to pick out these really important pieces from the prompt, because we know that's what PFO is all about, knowing what mode they're being asked to write in, and then being able to really respond or answer the entire prompt or topic. So we're going to read the text set. We do have 4 sources today to read. This is all about light pollution, as we know. And we will start with source 1. I'm going to have it on the screen. If you have these sources printed out, feel free to mark the text for pieces of evidence that you might think students would use. If not, that's okay. We have everything we need here on the screen. Like I mentioned, you do need to be very familiar with the text sets when scoring. And now I will start by reading text 1, and then I will ask for volunteers to read the remaining sources. Source 1, a light pollution study near you. Thousands of years ago, people looked up at the starry night sky and saw thousands of twinkling stars. They imagined star patterns and star gods. The night sky was a major part of their lives. Ancient sky watchers timed the rising of certain stars or sky patterns and used them as a sky calendar to help decide when to plant and harvest certain crops. Today, the nighttime sky has changed, and for some people, it has almost disappeared. If you live in a big city, ask yourself, what looks brighter, the lights in the buildings or the lights in the sky? The answer most likely will be that the lights in the buildings are brighter than the stars. Businesses that operate at night must have lighting, that's obvious. But now let's add in light from street poles and highways, security lights, sports fields, and lit billboards. When you combine all these sources of light, you have so much that it actually illuminates the night sky and makes it hard to see the stars. A satellite photograph of North America shows that the most populated areas, particularly Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Los Angeles, and generally along the east and west coasts, have the most light output at night. Here it is almost impossible to do any sky watching at night. Light pollution is the term that describes the effect of artificial lights on the night sky. But there are concerns even greater than just the increased difficulty of seeing stars. Some studies of light pollution show environmental impacts with changes in animal behavior and plant growth. For example, birds blinded by lights glowing in high-rise buildings have often become disoriented and flown into the buildings. If you live in a light polluted area, try this simple technique for naked eye viewing. Cup your hands around your eyes to block out some of the unwanted background light. How much better is your view now? If I could have someone read source 2.
I will.
Thank you.
Source 2, Sources of Light Pollution by Renee Bauer. Light pollution happens when artificial lights make it hard to see the night sky. Most light pollution is caused by outdoor lights, such as street lamps. Many outdoor lights shine upward or sideways. This light escapes upward. It scatters and brightens the night sky. The brightness makes the sky harder to see. Air pollution can also cause light pollution. Air pollution happens when harmful particles are released in the air. These particles can harm people, plants, and animals. The particles also make light pollution even worse. They make more light scatter at night. Outdoor lights that send all light downward reduce light pollution. These lights are called full cutoff lights. They are called full cutoff lights because they give no direct uplight. Another way to reduce light pollution is to use less powerful lamps or bulbs. Look at the diagram. The top shows an example of poor outdoor lighting. The light shines upward and sideways, which causes light pollution. The bottom shows an example of good outdoor lighting. The light shines downward. This minimizes light pollution.
Ooh. Sorry, not sure what happened.
That's okay.
All right, so if I could have someone read source 3.
I will.
Thank you.
Source 3, Light Pollution by Catherine Clark Fox. In most situations, light helps us see, but when it comes to looking at the night sky, light is actually a kind of pollution. It hampers our view of some of life's most spectacular sights, stars, planets, and even galaxies. When I was a little boy, I loved the night sky, recalls Robert Gent of the International Dark Sky Association, an organization working to reduce light pollution. I remember looking up and the sky was filled with stars, and I asked, how many are there? How far away are they? Can we visit them? I became an astronomer because I was amazed by their beauty, he says. Now in most big cities, kids can't see the stars like I did. Normally, about 2,500 individual stars are visible to the human eye without using any special equipment. But because of light pollution, you actually see just 200 to 300 from today's suburbs and fewer than a dozen from a typical city. Only 1 in 3 Americans can see our own galaxy, the dazzling Milky Way, with the naked eye. Those people live far away from the lights of big cities, office buildings, and shopping malls. Many cities and towns have passed laws limiting lights at night, making sure enough shine for safety without creating a lot of light pollution. Light pollution affects more than our view of the heavens. Research shows that lots of nighttime light can harm wildlife. Migrating birds sometimes fly over cities and become confused by the brightness, flying in circles until they drop from exhaustion. Sea turtles need dark beaches for nesting and won't approach bright lights. Too much light at night may even affect human health. Scientists are still learning more. For all these reasons, researchers are working on ways to use lights only when and where they are truly needed. Everyone deserves to look up at the infinite sky and wonder about the unbounded universe, says Jen.
Thank you. And source 4.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Source 4, cops save sea turtles hatching at Florida resort. Sarasota officer Derek Conley was on patrol at 1 a.m. Saturday when he saw sea turtle hatchlings crawling toward the front door of the Lido Beach resort. A passerby also told Conley that several dozen other baby turtles were crawling around the hotel's parking lot. Conley, along with some resort guests, scooped up the hatchlings into a box and released them into the water. I began collecting hatchlings from the streets and stopped traffic several times to do so, wrote Conley in the report. Conley also called 2 area marine rescue groups. Sea turtles nest from May 1st to October 31st in Florida. Sea turtles make anywhere from 40,000 to 84,000 nests in the state each year. Adult females nest every 2 or 3 years and lay several nests in one season. They emerge from the water to nest on the beach mostly at night. Nests average 100 eggs, which incubate in the sand for about 60 days, depending on the species. According to biologists, sea turtle hatchlings are born with the instinct to move toward the brightest direction. On a natural beach, this direction is the light of the open horizon, which would be why Sarasota turtles were headed toward the hotel's front door.
Thank you so much. Let's remind ourselves of the prompt, and that is to write an informative essay to present to their class about the problem of light pollution in the United States today. So students really need to be informing us about that problem of light pollution in the United States. So we are going to start looking at the anchor set or the sample essays right now. We are going to start with the highest scoring paper in the set. This is a 442. So while we already know what the paper scored, what we're going to focus on today is really just picking out those pieces, those strategies, those elements within each response that fit within those score points, so that when you are doing your own scoring of student responses, you're able to identify and kind of match up some of those similar traits within responses in order to determine the score point. So we're going to start with sample essay number 1. If you did have these printed, you are able to kind of highlight and mark the text as you go for the elements that you're looking for in a response. If you don't have it printed, no worries. We're going to read through each one and then stop and talk about some of the key points that make it fit within a score point. So again, this is a 10. It is one of the higher scoring papers, and it is probably the highest 10 in this particular set of essays. Imagine bright city lights with thousands of stars twinkling. Soon enough, all those twinkling stars will be out of sight. Light pollution is causing problems for plants, animals, and people. Luckily, something can be done to help prevent light pollution. Light pollution can be found almost everywhere. But what is light pollution? Light pollution is mainly formed by bright city lights. Have you ever been to a big city like New York? Most likely, when you look up, all you see is bright city lights from cars, poles, and buildings. According to Sources of Light Pollution by Renee Bauer, air pollution is formed when other lights, such as pole or building lights, make it hard to see the night sky. Most bigger and popular cities have a harder time seeing the stars at night than someone who doesn't live in a bright city. Not only that, but air pollution also plays a role in light pollution. Even though air pollution is probably not the major cause of light pollution, it helps spread light pollution even more. According to the first and second paragraphs of Sources of Light Pollution, when lights shine upwards or sideways, the light scatters upwards and brightens the sky. When there is air pollution, it can make the light scatter even more, making it brighter in the sky. Many populated and bright cities have more light pollution than cities that are not. Light pollution is like the rotten egg in the cake batter. Light pollution makes the lights in the sky harder to see and can even harm the animals nearby. Have you ever looked up in the sky years ago and saw millions of stars you couldn't even count? Nowadays, you'd probably only see a few dozens or less. According to the article Light Pollution by Catherine Clark Fox, we'd normally be able to see about 2,500 stars alone. In the 5th paragraph, the author states that only a third of all Americans can see our galaxy, and those people are far away from city lights. Light pollution doesn't only block out the view of the stars, but it can also harm the animals. Have you ever watched a video or television show where sea turtle hatchlings move toward the sea, and then people have bright flashlights? According to Cop Save Sea Turtle Hatchling at a Florida resort, sea turtles have an instinct to move towards the light. If they see bright lights elsewhere, they might follow it, which can be very dangerous for them. Light pollution causes trouble for the sky and animals. Light pollution is present almost anywhere. Most likely, stopping light pollution would not be too easy since light is present everywhere, from buildings to cars, but we can help to reduce the light pollution. We can prevent light pollution by using less powerful lights. Most people like bright homes in cities so they can see better, so they use brighter lights. However, using bright lights can send up more light particles, brightening the sky by the minute. Brighter lights send more light pollution than dim lights. Many lamps have light facing upwards. According to sources of light pollution, the light escapes upwards, which of course creates more light pollution. If we were to only use lights that face downwards, we would reduce a lot of the light pollution. Using dimmer lights and lights that face downwards will help prevent the light pollution, according to a light pollution study near you. Lights are present everywhere and are very helpful in many cases. However, we should reduce the light pollution in the air for our own sake and for animals. Using less bright lights in cities can help us see the beauties of the night sky and will help animals to survive. So hopefully, as you read that essay with me, you were able to pick out some of the strengths in that response. And I'm going to show you a few of them right here. So in just looking at the first page of this response, some of the notes are that this is a self-sufficient multi-paragraph essay, stands alone. It's truly an informative article. They're orienting the reader throughout. They have original thought right from the get-go, kind of starting with that setting the scene. This is kind of that idea of a hook. You'll see that the controlling idea does forecast possibilities to talk about plants, animals, people. There's some original thought examples to extend definitions, main idea. There are 3 body paragraphs in this particular response, but just know that that's not a requirement. It's really all about the balance of evidence and elaboration. So it could have been just as strong with 2 really meaty body paragraphs. And then off to the side, some of the things that you'll want to kind of consider and pay attention to when you're scoring is really that kind of progression of ideas, the transitions that are used, that balance of evidence and elaboration, all the way down to those sentence variety, word choice, citations, and things of that sort. As we read through, you might have noticed there were even a few convention errors, but nothing enough to make it drop in score. So here are the annotations that the state provides us for this particular paper. It very, very descriptively describes each part of the paper and why it fits within that 4, which is, remember, kind of doing it well. It's beyond mastery of the standards. I won't read this to you word for word, but just know you have this document that is included in your resources, and it really even, breaks it down to specific points or elements of, evidence and elaboration. It does use evidence from multiple sources. I think, in fact, maybe from every single source. And then it has a variety of elaborative techniques such as definition, examples, insight. So it really goes on to show you all of the different strategies that can be used for elaboration and why this paper would be considered their highest 442 in the set. Now we're going to look at the second paper in the set. This one also scored a 442, meaning it received a 10 overall. But what we want to think about a little bit is that this is going to be a lower scoring 442. So if you didn't already know, within each range, there's going to be kind of a range. You're going to have something that may be a low, maybe a mid, and maybe a high, but it still falls within that overall scoring domain. So if I could have a volunteer read this essay for me.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
There's a big serious problem going on. That problem is light pollution. There are three main reasons this is a big and serious problem. First, light pollution can harm the animals. Second, light pollution prevents us from seeing the night sky and stars. Last, light pollution can harm wildlife by preventing plants from growing. The first main reason light pollution is a problem in the United States is because light pollution can harm many of the animals. Light pollution harms animals by not letting the animals see completely where they are going at night. Animals that light pollution mostly harm are birds and sea turtles. An example is when a sea turtle hatchling just hatches, it will go in the way of the lights. According to the text, Conley saw sea turtles hatchlings crawling toward the front door. Page 17, paragraph 22. That shows that sea turtles were going to go inside of the resort. That would have really harmed them. Another example is birds blinded by lights glowing in the high-rise office buildings have become disoriented and flown into buildings. Page 14, paragraph 6. I really think that light pollution is a big problem to the animals. The second main reason light pollution is a problem is because light pollution does not let us see the night sky and stars. To me, that is a problem because first, it would be nice to see the night sky and stars. Second, because if you ever got lost, you could use a constellation to guide you through the night. Though if you cannot see the stars or constellations, you cannot get guided and find your way. An example is on page 16, paragraph 15. It says, kids can't see the night stars like I did. I thought that meant a lot. It showed that nowadays kids really can't get a good look at the night sky and stars. I believe that could be a big problem since maybe you have a project at school on that and then you can't see the night sky and stars. You probably couldn't do your project. Light pollution is a big problem. The last main reason light pollution is a big problem is because light pollution prevents plants from growing. I think that is a major problem because with no plants, we would not get oxygen that we need to survive. Also, if a plant cannot produce food, the plant does not grow. That means we won't be able to get that food. An example on page 14, paragraph 16, it says studies of light pollution show environmental impacts with changes in animal behavior and plant growth. The part about plant growth is bad, like I said. I think plants need to grow right away, so let's try to stop the bad plant growth by preventing light pollution. Help prevent light pollution. It is becoming a big and serious problem in the United States because it harms animals, doesn't let us see the night sky, and it prevents plant growth. We should really try to stop light pollution by reducing the use of big lights.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what I want you to focus on and notice in this particular paper is first that it's okay not to love this response, right? This is definitely sounds a little bit different than the previous response. And this is kind of what we might call that working man's 442. So while it still reaches that area of a 442, it's not quite as kind of developed and comprehensive as the first 442 we looked at. But the other reason I like you to look at this example is that you see that the way the student cited or referenced their sources is very different in this example. In the first one we looked at, they were consistently using the title and the author's name. And in this one, they really stuck to just page number and paragraph number in parentheses. And it's nice to see that a student can get a 10 by doing either of those strategies with citations. So like I said before, the state doesn't have a preference whatsoever as long as they are citing their source. So here are the annotations for this particular paper. You'll see that it goes on to explain very specifically information, including the variety of transitions, the logical progression of ideas, that thorough and convincing evidence for the response, several references to the source material, And then really it's thorough and effectively insightful elaboration techniques. And then they give you examples of exactly the sentences the students used that they're seeing as those elaboration techniques. So again, this one might be more of a working man's 442 or a lower 442, but it really does still have all those characteristics of a 10. All right, we're going to read the next paper in the set, and this is actually a 432. So one of the things that you might notice in your students' paper is that sometimes they actually can score higher in PFO than they do in evidence and elaboration. It's really because that evidence and elaboration domain is super challenging. And a lot of times our kids are really, really strong with the PFO part, but they're just lacking a little bit of skill in the evidence and elaboration part. And this is an example of that, where it scores high enough in a PFO to get a 4, but it's not quite as high in evidence and elaboration, which drops it down to a 3. But it is still considered proficient because anything above a 332 is proficient. If I could have a reader read this for me, I'd appreciate it.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Light pollution is made when our man-made artificial lights block people's, animals, and even plants' vision of the sky. It affects all of us in a harmful and damaging way. It can change plant growth, animal behavior, and it can cause environmental impacts. Light pollution may become a hazard to our health too. The problem with light pollution is that it can cause all these changes. And the worst part is that light pollution are caused by our artificial lights. For example, in a light pollution study near you, it states that light pollution can cause changes in the natural environments, animals' behavior, and plants' growth. For example, birds blinded by lights glowing in high-rise office buildings have become disoriented and flown into buildings. This quote shows just one example of the horrible effects on light pollution. This alone can cause a decrease in the bird population. That is another problem with light pollution. It can cause a decrease in plants or animals' populations. In addition to the environmental, animal, and plant changes, light pollution can be reduced. You can simply use less powerful lamps in your home to reduce the amount of light pollution. Light pollution is mostly caused by outdoor lighting. For example, before I said that light pollution can cause changes in nature. And since nature is the outdoors, outdoor light causes the most light pollution. You can use outdoor lamps that point all of its light downwards to reduce light pollution. Light pollution can also be caused by air pollution. For instance, in sources of light pollution, it states air pollution happens when harmful particles are released in the air. These particles can harm people, plants, and animals. The particles also make light pollution even worse. They make more light scatter at night. As you see, air pollution can cause light pollution. In source 3, or light pollution, it says light pollution might even affect our health. Not many people in the cities can see the beautiful night sky because of all the light pollution. And as I said, light pollution can have a large effect on birds. Bird populations might decrease because light pollution can cause birds to crash into buildings. Another example of light pollution's harmful effects is in COP Saves Sea Turtles hatching at Florida Resort. Baby sea turtles are extremely affected by light pollution. They have an instinct to waddle towards the light. Usually they go towards their habitat, the ocean, because of the moon reflecting upon the water. But because of light pollution, they are going toward resorts and cities. They die off because they do not have enough food and because they are not adapted to our neighborhoods. For example, in source 4, it states, according to biologists, Sea turtle hatchlings are born with the instinct to move toward the brightest direction. On a natural beach, this direction is the light of the open horizon, which could be why the Sarasota turtles were headed toward the hotel's front door. As you see, the resort's lighting was bright, so the young sea turtle hatchlings went toward the hotel. In conclusion, light pollution is a harmful type of pollution that can change natural environments, animals, plants, and even us in a hazardous way.
Thank you. So as you're probably noticing as we read through this response, it's still a very, very effective response. In fact, it's actually more than adequate in the area of PFO. That's why it's receiving that score of a 4. So a few things to point out in this particular response is the idea that the controlling idea is very clear. It stays tightly focused on those harmful aspects of light pollution kind of throughout. The progression of ideas really is effective in this paper, and it gives that feeling of cohesion and completeness in that area of PFO. And evidence and elaboration, it got knocked down to a 3, and it's really just more of an adequate support and evidence versus that really, really thorough and convincing support and evidence. And then when you look at the elaboration, it does include some elaboration, but not quite as a balance of it as those papers that we read that scored a 4 in this category. And then in conventions, we're still seeing 2s in conventions. There may be a few errors here and there, but not enough to drop any of them down below a 2. We're going to read sample essay 4, and this is our first 332. So this is really our first time seeing a paper that kind of just meets proficiency within those categories of a 332. This is definitely a great place for our students to be. A score of an overall 8 is fantastic. And if we could get all of our students here, that would be definitely a great place to be. So if I could have someone read this 332.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Have you heard of light pollution? Well, light pollution is pollution caused by light and is harmful in many ways. There are many problems from light pollution in the United States, and many reasons cause it to happen. Many effects happen, and some are animal harmness and not being able to see our galaxy. Light pollution harms nature and us. Animals of all kinds are harmed by the powerful light pollution. The animals are tricked by light from their everyday movements. For instance, the article Light Pollution states migrating birds sometimes fly over cities and become confused by the brightness, flying in circles until they drop from exhaustion. In the passage, Cobb saves sea turtles hatching at Florida resort, it states, I began collecting sea turtles hatchlings from the street and stopped traffic several times to do so, wrote Connolly in a report. Also, according to biologists, sea turtle hatchlings are born with the instinct to move towards the brightest direction. With that, animals could risk their life by being tricked with light pollution. Why can't we see our amazing galaxy? Because of light pollution. With so much light in big cities, not even a dozen stars can be seen. In the article, A Light Pollution Study Near You, it states, businesses that operate at night need light that's obvious, but that add street lights, highway security lights, sport fields, and lit billboards. With all that light, it seems that the galaxy just disappeared on us. In big cities such as Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Los Angeles, the whole galaxy doesn't appear to the people. When you're out in the country, an amazing twinkling sky emerges after sunset because there's no streetlights, billboards, and not many businesses. And all light pollution does no good to nature, people, or anything. Many tricked animals die or risk their life and think how it would be to grow up never seeing the galaxy. We can stop light pollution by reducing light in towns and neighborhoods, by buying average lights, not big, bright ones, for cities. Together, light pollution will stop forever.
Thank you. So you're probably noticing a little bit of loss of control in this paper, meaning you're not seeing the level of control by the student as you were in those 4.4s or even that 4.3. So a few things to point out is that it's definitely adequate. It's adequately maintained. It's adequately sustained. There are some transitions. The intro and the conclusion are adequate, although it's super repetitive in some places, especially the introduction, kind of many ways, many problems, many reasons, many effects, kind of seeing that same phrase over and over again, lessens that control a little bit. Evidence and elaboration, it's adequate. There's some variety in elaborative techniques. Sentence structure is somewhat varied, but again, just not seeing that level of control or kind of going above and beyond. You are seeing a few errors in spelling and word usage, but not enough to drop it yet in conventions. All right, our next paper is actually our first anchor paper that falls below the standards proficiency, and this one is because of conventions specifically. So proficiency of the standards is a 3 in PFO, a 3 in evidence and elaboration, and a 2 in conventions. So this paper does meet it in the first 2 domains, but it actually drops down in conventions. And hopefully you're going to see a little bit more patterns of those errors to kind of see why it does drop to that 1 range. I will go ahead and read this one out loud, and then we'll talk about it. Starlight, star bright, wish upon a star tonight. Wait, why can't I see any stars? Well, you can thank light pollution for that. Oh, sorry, lost myself here. Well, you can thank light pollution for that. If you want to know why your wish isn't coming true, then keep reading. To get us on the move, it says in paragraph 6 that light pollution is the term that describes the effect of artificial lights on the night sky, which in kid-friendly words means that when light hits the sky, there are really small stars that have only a little light. So when some source of brightness is hitting the star, how are you supposed to see its small light? Exactly, you can't. Also in paragraph 16, it states normally about 2,500 stars are visible to the human eye without using any special equipment. But because of light pollution, you can actually see just 200 to 300 on suburbs. To keep our pace, light pollution can also affect animals and even us. From paragraph 22, it tells us that a police officer was on duty and saw sea turtles crossing a road that led to a hotel doorstep. To support that, it also stated in paragraph 24, he began collecting hatchlings from the street and stopped traffic several times to do so, wrote Connolly in a report. So wait just 1 second. What if the police officer wasn't there to help those innocent newborns? More than half of them probably would have either been hit by a car or trampled on by us. Also, what about us? It says in paragraph 20, too much light at night may even affect human health. To wrap everything up, I hope you have learned a lot about light pollution and what it affects. But hold your horses. There is a way to prevent this. Try not to have lights facing directly up to your night skies. At this time, you may choose to go back to wishing your wish, but make sure the lights are off so the magic can do its job. This paper makes me giggle every time. I can just like feel the personality in this kid and his response or her response. And I really appreciate when kids are able to incorporate their humor or that voice or that style or even sarcasm into their papers. We want to encourage those students who have those skills to definitely build that in. It gives the scorers a little bit of a break from kind of the mundane, really boring responses. So personality is definitely a plus here, and it's cute and fun to read. But let's talk about how this paper falls within proficiency on the first 2 domains, but does finally drop in that convention score. So if you see here in the annotations, we're seeing that, you know, the controlling idea, it's implied within the introduction. but we are able to determine it, and it's adequately sustained within that purpose, audience, and task. It does have transitions to clarify relationships. When it gets to evidence and elaboration, there are many references and details from the source material, and they're adequately integrated. Then you have an adequate use of elaborative techniques and some examples of those. And then when it gets into conventions, although the errors in spelling, usage, sentence formation, and capitalization, so you'll see that now we have more than just one or two things going on. It's more than just spelling and punctuation. Now you have usage, you have sentence formation, you have multiple things happening in this response that really knock it down to that one in conventions. So use these annotations when you're using these anchor sets to go back and remind yourselves of why they're falling within these score points, so that when you're scoring your own student responses, you're able to identify those same patterns throughout. We are now going to look at a paper that is scoring a 322. So I said earlier that it's very common for students to get a higher score in that first domain, just because it's a little bit easier for our students. So this is an example. They did reach proficiency in PFO, but they did not reach it in evidence and elaboration, but we are back to a 2 in conventions, so you'll see less errors there. If I could have a volunteer read for me.
I can read.
Thank you.
What's the problem with light pollution in America? Well, the problem is that the buildings in the United States use light to be able to see, but one thing you're not going to see is most likely the night sky. The reason you can't see the sky is because of light pollution. What's light pollution? Light pollution is what happens when there's too much light going up. In source number 2, paragraph 5, sentences 3 through 5, it says the light shines upward and sideways, which causes light pollution. The bottom shows an example of good outdoor lighting. The light shines downwards. This minimizes light pollution. One cause and effect about light pollution is that baby sea turtles were hatching, and they always go for the light. So the baby sea turtles were heading towards the hotel, like it says in source number 4, last paragraph. According to marine biologists, sea turtle hatchlings are born with instinct to move toward the brightest direction on a natural beach. This direction is the light of the open horizon, which could be why Sarasota turtles were headed toward the hotel's front door. Light pollution is also terrible because we can't see as much as we used to. Then in the future, if we get more light pollution, we won't be able to tell the weather, if there's a storm coming, or maybe even an asteroid hurtling to Earth. If we can minimize light pollution, this would not happen to us in the future. In source 3, paragraph 4, it says normally about 2,500 individual stars are visible to the human eye without any special equipment. But because of light pollution, you can actually see just 200 to 300 from today's suburbs, and fewer than a dozen in a typical city. Now come on, everyone. Let's help minimize light pollution to see the amazing and beautiful stars again. Just tell your friends and tell them to pass the message on to other people. We can do this. We can change the world little by little and make it a beautiful and wonderful world. What are you waiting for? Let's go minimize light pollution.
Thank you. All right, let's take a look at the annotations for this piece. It's really interesting to see the descriptions. So what we see here is, again, that adequately sustained for your PFO, giving that controlling idea, remaining maintained throughout the response. There may be a little bit more loosely related material here, but it's not enough to drop this to a 2 in PFO. Really, overall, it's adequate in this domain. Now for evidence and elaboration, this is where it definitely drops below proficiency, and let's talk about why, because it's not a super brief response. But when you focus in on specifically the evidence and elaboration, you'll see that while text evidence is present, elaboration is minimal. So most evidence is presented as quotes, which is fine, absolutely acceptable way to use evidence, but you'll see that there's very little original thought to go with those quotes. There's a weak attempt to elaborate, and it's kind of a funny one with the asteroid hurtling to Earth, but really that's one of the only places that they even attempt to provide that elaboration or original thought. I want you to focus in here on the attempts to reference the source. So they did absolutely include citations. So that's not what kept them from getting a 3. However, you'll notice that the state says excessive references to the same source material actually start to impede the fluency of the response. So I remember when I talked about citations and references, we talked about keeping them simple but varied. So that idea of saying in source number, paragraph 5, sentences 3 through 5, like we don't need all of that, right? Just one of those pieces is enough to give credit to the source material. So again, few errors in spelling and usage, but not enough to drop it to that 1. We are going to look at our first overall 222 paper. I will tell you from being in kind of this text-based world for a while now, this is a super kind of just average score that many students can get to pretty quickly and easily. If you scored your baselines, or if you're in the middle of scoring your mid-years, you might see that you just have a lot of 6s. It's kind of a typical score for students, but it's really good to know that when you get to this point with a student, that it's not too difficult to get them up to that 3 or proficiency range in those domains. So let's look at our first 222, if I could have a volunteer.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Light pollution is a huge deal in the United States today. Animals and people can have health issues when there is light pollution. I'm going to write a story about why light pollution is bad for us. The first example of why light pollution is bad for us is that animals and people can have health issues during this time. Some studies of light pollution show environmental impact, such as changes in animal behavior and plant growth. One day, baby sea turtles came to the front door of a hotel because they go toward the brightest direction, and the hotel was the brightest direction. So the guy who worked there scooped them up and put them back into the ocean. The sea turtles could have gotten hurt during this time. The next example of why light pollution is bad for us is the sources of light pollution. Light pollution happens when artificial lights make it hard to see the night sky. Most light pollution is caused by outdoor lights, such as street lamps. In conclusion, light pollution can make us have health issues and get animals sick. The street lights that have poor outdoor lighting and shine upward and sideways causes pollution. A street light that shines downward minimizes light pollution.
Thank you. So we are starting to feel a little bit more of that loss of control. This is considered probably a high 2-2, but you are starting to see a little bit more of the student trying to do it versus them doing it adequately. So again, there is a range within each score point. You can have a high 2 and you can have a low 2. This is one of the higher 2s. So let's talk about why it kind of got stuck in that 2 range, why it didn't get to that 3 in these first 2 categories. So focusing on the controlling idea is presented, an introduction is provided, but the conclusion actually introduced some new material that wasn't really connected, and that kind of starts to drop the score in that area. A few transitions, but very little variety in those transitions. Evidence and elaboration, we're going to start to determine that this evidence is more cursory from the text. And there is some irrelevant evidence that doesn't really support their controlling idea. So that's why we really need students to determine what their controlling idea is and really pick that most relevant evidence for their specific ideas. Word choices are at times a little imprecise, not necessarily as academic and formal, and they do not include any references to the text, you guys. So this is one example where they did not have a citation or a reference, and that's one of the other reasons why it gets stuck in that 2 for evidence and elaboration. Minor errors in spelling and usage, but again, adequate command of conventions. Now we are actually going to look at another 222. So this would be considered a little bit lower of a 222 in the range. And then once we read this, we'll really talk about why this one also fits that same score point. I will go ahead and read this one. Light pollution is made up of a lot of different unnatural lights like street lamps. light pollution is becoming a huge problem that has to be stopped. Light pollution is a big problem because of artificial light sources from lights going upward. This can be stopped. It can be stopped by using outdoor lamps and putting it where it is needed in the city. First, we put outdoor lamps down as a substitute for street lamps that can shoot light upward. The reason we do this is because outdoor lamps minimizes light shooting upward, which creates light pollution. Also, we will put street lamps where they are needed. This will reduce the cause of light pollution. Light pollution is also caused when there is too much light in the city, preventing kids from seeing the stars. We can fix that by putting street lamps where they're needed. For example, there is a house on one side of the street and a junkyard on the other. Where would you put the street lamp? The answer is you'll put it where the junkyard is. The reason why is because if you put it in front of a house, you'll prevent the child from seeing stars. All in one, those reasons are why light pollution is caused, because of street lamps and the small amounts of outdoor lamps. So this one should start to be a little bit more obvious to you and why it is falling within that 222 range. It's pretty repetitive as far as the body paragraph and the ideas about the street lamps and the outdoor lamps goes. The sentences are not very varied in structure and formatting. And you'll also notice that it's really in the structure of a BME or an IBC, meaning there's just one body paragraph for this response. And we need to know that students will not ever hit proficiency in those domains without a balance of evidence and elaboration, meaning 2 to 3 body paragraphs. So this structure of just one body paragraph will never be enough to hit that 3-3 because it's not enough writing to show a balance of evidence and elaboration. So we need to make sure our students are doing those complete 4 to 5 paragraph responses. So in the annotations, we see a little bit more about those ideas, kind of that uneven progression of ideas, a weak attempt at elaboration, and again, no references to citations to sources or the text, but still a 2 in conventions. All right, let's look at a 111. We're going to see how these students are really in that area of they're just not quite sure what to do. They're a little off track. We're not really sure who's driving. And let's see an example of what this looks like. If I could have a volunteer.
I will.
Thank you.
One of the problems of light pollution is that meaning of the birds and the turtles are getting confused of where they need to go, and sometimes they even get hurt. Also, it is just not good for the
I think it's environment, but it's inferment.
Okay, and you have to read it the way it's written, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I thought so. Inferment, or the skies, or the animals. Another reason light pollution is a problem is because when there's too much light, the light can hurt animals, humans, and plants. The stars will start to fade because there is too much light. The worst problem of all is that the light pollution can hurt, confuse, and make things fade, like animals, plants, humans, stars. Those are the problems that light pollution does to important things that hurt the environment.
Thank you. They get a little trickier to read when they're down in these score points. But this is a really good example for us because we are going to have students, we're going to come across responses that are very similar to this in structure, in spelling errors and usage errors. And it's nice to be able to have this tool as a resource to you to help kind of determine the score points. So let's talk about this is enough to receive a score, meaning it's going to be a 111, the lowest it can be without receiving an overall 0. And let's talk about why. So it is related to the topic. So that's one thing it has going for it. But it is demonstrating kind of little awareness of that task, which is to inform us about the problem of light pollution. There's not really an introduction. It looks like there's an introduction, but instead that first paragraph really just begins by mentioning the first problem, meaning the controlling idea is somewhat ambiguous. It's a little difficult to discern. It's really just kind of a list of vague problems. So this one should be pretty evident of why it falls into that one in PFO. Evidence and elaboration, it's minimal support or evidence, little use of sources, facts and details. The evidence that they do use is repetitive. Expression of ideas is vague, limited vocabulary, and again, no referencing or citations. It's pretty easy to determine a 1 in conventions. It was not enough to get a 0, though, I want you to keep in mind. So there's lots of spelling errors, there's capitalization errors, punctuation, and usage, but you're still able to understand the response, and the errors are not enough to impede that understanding. All right, let's take a look. I think this is our last response before our copied response. This is going to be received that 110. So this is your example in the anchor set of a 0 in conventions. So hopefully you're able to recognize that when your own students make mistakes like this one. So to begin with, the problem about light pollution is that we can't see all of the things in the night sky, and they are beautiful, very beautiful, but some kids aren't able to see it. And maybe if they do get to see it, they would want to be an astronaut or something else. In conclusion, I think that we should fight light pollution. So that's it. That's the entire response. So we're starting to notice that sometimes when responses are super brief, it is going to affect that score point because you're not able to see enough evidence to really determine balance of evidence, really see elaboration or any of those elements. You'll notice that that first sentence is a very lengthy run-on sentence. And within this very short response, there is really that lack of command. So the intended meaning is often obscured by errors and sentence formation and usage. So because this response is so short, remember it's density versus severity. So the lack of amount of writing in this case is going to make it a little easier to drop it in conventions much faster. Because with only 2 sentences, they're showing so many errors that you're almost you almost have to give it to that 0. But again, it's going to be scoreable because it is related to the topic. You know, it does refer to the night sky as beautiful and children wanting to be an astronaut, but it's not really clear evidence from the text. There's no references. So, you know, they have an idea of what they were reading about and what the topic is. So it's enough to be scoreable, but not, but it's going to really hit that lowest score on the domain and on the rubric. The last paper we are going to look at is the response that the state added to the anchor set in 2018. So before that, this response was not available to us as a resource. But what they've done is they have, like I said earlier, kind of just really started to determine how students are getting a little bit more crafty at copying text or paraphrasing text and not really including any of that elaboration or original thought. So we're going to read through this response, and then I'm going to show you how it has been determined to be a 0 or a copied response versus receiving a score. And this is kind of gives you an idea of how a teacher might be fooled by what looks and sounds to be like a really good response. So if you live in a big city, ask yourself, what looks brighter, the lights in the buildings or the lights in the sky? The answer most likely will be that the lights in the buildings are brighter than the stars. Today, the nighttime sky has changed, and for some people, it has almost disappeared. Light pollution is the word that describes the effect of artificial lights on the night sky. But there are concerns even greater than just the increased difficulty of seeing pretty stars. There is a problem of light pollution in the United States. In some situations, light helps us see, but when it comes to looking at the night sky, when it comes to looking at the night sky, light is actually a kind of pollution. According to source 1, some studies of light pollution show environmental impacts with changes in animal behavior and plant growth. Sometimes birds blinded by glowing lights in tall office buildings become disoriented and flown into the buildings. In addition, air pollution can cause light pollution too. It happens when harmful particles are released in the air. Particles can harm people, plants, and even animals. They make more light scatter at night, and it makes light pollution even worse. Also, light pollution hampers our view of life's most spectacular sights: stars, planets, and even galaxies. About 2,500 individual stars are visible to the human eye without using any special equipment. But because of light pollution, you can see just 200 to 300. Many cities and towns have passed laws limiting lights at night, making sure enough shine for safety without creating a lot of light pollution. To sum it up, it is almost impossible to do any sky watching at night, but if you live in a light polluted area, try this simple technique. Cup your hands around your eyes to block out some of the unwanted background light. How much better is your view now? So you'll see this little explanation down here that this response has actually been purposely constructed in order to illustrate methods of copying text. So unlike all of the other essays we've read, this one was actually not written by a real student, but instead it's provided as a resource for us so that we can see all of the different techniques that students might use that are still considered copying. So this is a good idea for you to go and look at the 4th grade sampler set, even the middle school sampler sets, to see some other examples of copied responses. So you really start to be able to identify that within your own students' writing. This is one of my favorite resources that they give to us with this particular response. And what they've done is they've highlighted and then identified off to the side where this information came from. And this really is a great visual to show you why this paper received a 0 or a copied score. Everything you see highlighted there came directly from either the sources or the prompt. It might be directly quoted, it might be copied, it might be paraphrased, but every bit of it was something that was mentioned or talked about in the text set. The things that aren't highlighted are just a word here or there or some transitions here or there, and that's not going to be enough to make it scoreable. So when I said that the scorers know the text sets really, really well, this is why. They were able to go back and determine, like, oh no, I think that was somewhere in the text, or I think they mentioned that somewhere in the text, or they basically said that somewhere in the text. And when they suspect that a paper is copied, they actually give it to like the scoring director. It's not just one person that makes the determination, and they'll actually go through and highlight it just like this one to really make sure they're doing it correctly. In addition to the highlighting, they're going to give you some annotations, really talking about it's primarily copied text, no original writing. So it does result in that copied code or that 0 overall. So that concludes our scoring portion of today's training, and really we're wrapping up the entire session. So what I wanted to remind you of is where to find all of these resources, as well as the 4th grade sampler set and even the middle school sampler sets, so that you can see as many responses as possible with annotations. You can use them with your students. You can use them as you score, but so many really, really good resources at fsassessments.org. The last document I want to show you is something that I have shared with literacy leaders, and it is in the teacher resource page on Canvas for all teachers to access. But this is a document I have personally used for years with my students. In addition to scoring using the rubric, I need to know where to go with my instruction. And just looking at some numbers saying, okay, 20 of my kids got a 5 or 20 of my kids got a 6, right? That doesn't tell me enough information to know where to go with my instruction. Because you can receive a 6 by getting a 3-2-1, you can receive a 6 by getting a 2-2-2, right? There's multiple ways you can get multiple score points. So the numbers aren't going to tell me a whole lot when I'm determining where do I need to teach a mini lesson, where do I need to completely reteach the whole class, where do I need to enrich or remediate. So I use this document called Analyzing Trends in Student Work. And what I like to do is, based on the needs of my students or based on where they're struggling, I will revise or edit the statements on the left side. So you see those anticipated trends or pain points. Instead of recording all of the things my students are doing well at, I'm going to focus on the things they're not doing well at. So for instance, I may be really focusing on if my students are unpacking the prompt. Like, the scores don't see the unpacking of the prompt, but in the classroom, I can see whether they're doing that or not, and I know that will affect their writing. So I'm going to start recording who didn't unpack the prompt. Then I might look at their text marking, who didn't text mark, who didn't plan, who didn't use multi-paragraphs, who didn't have an introduction, right? So I can adjust, add, and revise all of those statements on the left to meet the needs of my kids. So then what I would do is, if I determine that Emma, Brian, Ethan, Sarah, Jose, and Mark didn't unpack the prompt, then I'm going to pull them together in a small group, and we're really going to, focus on unpacking. If I notice that only Emma, Brian, and Ethan didn't do a plan, then that's something I'm going to discuss with those three individually while I'm conferencing with them. Or the last example is organizing into effective body paragraphs with big ideas. My entire class except Emily is struggling with that. So I know that's going to have to be a whole class reteach, find a new lesson, teach it to them again, because the whole class is struggling with that particular concept. So really, this document is completely optional for you. It is available in Canvas. It's just something that I like to use when I'm trying to record or analyze trends of my students' writing in order to really determine where I need to go with instruction. And when I email you guys this PowerPoint, I can also include this document for you, so you don't have to go searching for it. We're going to end this morning with a reflection. I'd love to hear from you. What did you learn about the process of analyzing student work with the rubric and the anchor set that might change your short or long-term instructional planning to positively impact student writing? So please tell me, what is something that we did today or that you learned today that was new, or that you want to go and use or implement with your kids or with your scoring or your implementation of writing? I'd love to hear from you guys. So if you want to unmute.
Well, this, for me, being in Florida again after 18 years, it gave me the knowledge to understand how to grade the prompts, because it was graded totally different in Texas. So I appreciate learning about the purpose, focus, and organization, and a lot of things that you went over with us that should help me be more relaxed about and scoring my papers next week.
Thank you.
I also really liked how you talked about giving the students the ability to add voice to their writing, because so often when they think about the informational piece of the writing, they just want to stick to the text, and then giving them the opportunity to really put in their own input and using, the I pronoun and being able to put in their own voice into their writing. So many times it's like you're taught not to do that when it's informational. It's only when it's opinion. So for you to bring that out, I think I'm definitely going to emphasize that more when I'm showing the kids the rubric and things like that.
Awesome.
I really like the analyzing trends sheet that you showed. I think that for me, just putting them in small groups based on like what they need is going to be a little bit more effective to conquer all the different needs in the classrooms.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone
That
else?
was the part that I find more helpful also.
Okay, great. That was at the very end. Sorry about that. But,
no, but the rest was very informative also. I did also like the way that you coded the rubrics with the commonalities and the differences.
Oh, great. I'm glad that worked for you guys. I know that's something that had never been shown to elementary teachers before. So I've been in Hillsborough for 17 years, but I've spent the majority of my career in secondary. And when I took this role for K-12, I really wanted to bring some of the really effective tools that we've been using in secondary down to elementary, so that our students can, benefit from all of those resources as well.
Yeah, it just makes it seem less overwhelming than looking at everything in each cell.
Absolutely makes sense. So here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me, you guys. It's been a weird year. We have not been able to see each other face to face or have regular PD or trainings. So thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with me. Feel free to reach out to me in email. You can call me, text me. I'd be happy to answer individual questions or clarify or confirm anything for you at any time. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can say goodbye. And thank you so much for joining. If you guys have any questions that you think of between now and next week, send me an email. I'd be happy to send you a response. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.